I don't really like to talk about accidents on this channel, but accidents, while tragic, offer an opportunity to learn from mistakes and allow for improvements to be recommended and implemented so the likelihood of them happening again is lowered. But there was a time that railway crashes were a form of entertainment, and today we look at the most infamous, the crash at Crush. It's 1896 and the Missouri, Kansas and Texas Railroad was in trouble. The country was coming fresh off the heels of a recession and passenger numbers were down and costs and demands for new railroads were soaring. Jobs and money were in short supply and the passenger agent at the time, William Crush, was ready to pitch his latest idea to get his passengers back and to fix the gaping hole in his finances. Crush had heard of a travelling salesman called A.L. Streeter who had performed an elaborate stunt the year before. He had taken two old railroad locomotives, set them on a purpose-built track and set them both off to crash into one another, with people paying a few dollars at a time to witness the event. The event was so popular, 5 more stage crashes had been planned and executed successfully around the country, but Crush wanted his event to be the grandest of them all. After getting backing from investors of his plan, Crush went into the yards and picked out 2 old steam locomotives, Baldwin's 30-ton locomotives numbered 999 and 1001. Both engines had been out of use for some time and were destined for the cutter's torch. The twin 35-foot engines had been replaced over 10 years prior with newer and more powerful 60-foot models. His plan, though, was not without concerns. One of the biggest concerns was that the engine's boilers and would they explode on impact. Engineers examined both engines and confirmed that as they knew how the engines would hit each other and the cladding on the boilers was strong and designed to withhold extreme pressures, there was little to no chance the boilers would rupture. It was all William Crush needed to hear, and he ordered the engines to be painted in red and green, and he began to publicise the event by touring them around the state. After borrowing a circus tent from the Ringling Brothers, Crush got to work on the site where the 2 locomotives would meet. He chose a large, desolate piece of land 14 miles north of Waco. The ground was fairly flat, with a railroad running nearby. The railroad would serve 2 purposes: getting punters to and from the site and allowing ease of access for the engines to get into position. Crush didn't want to risk the railroad itself, so a separate track was created for the crash site. The site was transformed into a practical city overnight. 2 new water wells were dug. Hundreds of vendors and sideshows descended on the site to greet punters. There were souvenir stands, food stands, a working railway station, VIP stands and a huge grandstand with several acts dedicated to pleasing the crowd before the big event. As alcohol was being served, Crush ordered that 200 police constables would patrol the area and keep the crowd safe, and a wooden jail was erected for anyone causing trouble. Again, safety was at the forefront of Crush's plan. A 200-yard cordon was put around the area where the engines were expected to meet, with a 100-yard cordon for photographers and the press. The locals called the new site Crush, and on the morning of the 15th of September, the engines were put in their places and had 6 boxcars attached. But not trusting the standard couplings, which were known to break under stress, the 6 cars were chained together to prevent them from coming apart. The boxcars were charged at a premium to prospective advertisers, and they were painted in an array of adverts. Thanks to Crush's clever marketing ploy, entry to the event was free, but 30 special excursion trains were laid on specifically for the event from around the state. Each ticket was around $3.50, which is the equivalent of $120 in today's currency. The hefty price tag did not dissuade punters, and every train was sold out within days. More trains were laid on for the event, and the approximate 20,000 expected attendance rate swelled to over 40,000. It was estimated that for the day, Crush was the 2nd largest city in Texas. A steady stream of people started to arrive throughout the day, and many enjoyed the carnival-like atmosphere. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had started to gather at the cordon and jostle for the best spots. The police had trouble keeping the massive crowds back, and the expected 4 p.m, the time that the crash was supposed to happen, came and went. Crush was forced to wait thanks to a delayed train. At 5:10, unable to delay any more, Crush mounted his horse and rode to the spot in between the two locomotives. The two engines met behind him and touched cow catchers, a handshake of sorts, and both engines started to set back to their starting positions. The crowd hushed as each engine was prepped, and the firemen stoked their fires. As soon as both crews signalled that the engines were ready, and with a wave of Crush's hat, both regulators were opened and the crews jumped to safety. The engines raced down the track, each one going faster and faster until they reached speeds of 50 miles an hour. With an ear-splitting screech as metal bent metal, both engines collided. The boxcars behind them pushed the two engines further into one another with their inertia while being turned into splinters. Almost as it started, the air was filled with silence. Then a boom as both boilers exploded in perfect unison. Tons of scalding metal, ranging from the size of a postage stamp to the size of a driving wheel, boiling water and chunks of wood rained onto the crowd. Those behind the ones in front, unknowing that they were injured, surged forward to grab a souvenir, only to be badly burned by the metal. One photographer, whose pictures of the crash are still world famous, lost an eye as a rivet pierced it. It was estimated that the two engines hit with over 1 million pounds of force, and the weighted cars behind them caused additional waves as they hit the two stricken locomotives. After the steam cleared, only the two end cars on either locomotive were standing. The rest was a steaming pile of metal and wood. The injuries from the crash were too numerous to document, but many suffered shrapnel injuries as well as burns, and 2 people lost their lives thanks to the debris. William Crush was fired on the spot for the accident and the intended public backlash once the incident hit the national headlines. Strangely though, the wave of negativity never materialised, and William was offered his job back the very next day. The families that did file lawsuits were placated with free lifetime passes and out-of-court settlements from the money made from the event. This was considered small change, and the whole event was declared a huge success. William Crush went on to work for the company right up until his retirement. His credibility none the worse for wear, and the practice of staging crashes using obsolete railway stock continued right up until the 1930s. By then, the practice had died out due to people seeing this as a waste of metal. While William Crush was the most infamous, there was another who turned the show of crashing locos into his job. Joseph Head-on Joe Connolly was the executioner of the railway world, having staged 70 crashes and destroyed 146 locomotives in his lifetime, and charged upwards of $3,000 plus a cut of the takings to put on a show. His shows would take on a more disturbing tone when he tried to up the ante by strapping dynamite to the front of the locomotive or put gasoline in the wagons to create a bigger spectacle, even going as far as naming the locomotives after political candidates, with punters cheering for their iron champion. Connolly's last crash was in 1932, where after the crash he simply walked away, knowing his career was over, blended into society, never to be heard from again. While the staging of crashes has become a morbid yet rather bizarre curiosity for some, for others it's very useful. For the movie business, where models were simply not going to do, 2 actual locomotives were crashed into one another for the film Denver and the Rio Grande, and in 2007 Top Gear staged a crash over a level crossing with a people carrier. But in many cases, either miniatures are used, like in Back to the Future Part 3, or a full-scale replica is created, like in Mission Impossible. or nowadays, CGI is utilised, giving that very realistic feel. For certain things though, a crash test is a must. The USA has the highest rated number of deaths on level crossings for any country in the world. Huge, long freight cavalcades cross the country and cross unmanned and unbarriered level crossings. These slow, long trains can be deceptive in their speed and power, and many people chance it to get across, otherwise be stuck for several minutes as the train goes in front of them. In 2018, the State of North Carolina Department of Transportation decided to hit this message home by staging a crash between a car and a train. The car was filled with crash test dummies, with the reports open to the public to show them the consequences of trying to race a train over a crossing. The footage, while it is staged, I will warn you, is not very comfortable to watch. The world has seen and is still reeling from the raw power of nuclear energy when things go wrong. In Wales, sheep production is being affected by the Chernobyl fallout over a quarter of a century after the event, and the town of Pripyat will be uninhabitable for generations to come. So the movement of nuclear materials has to be done with extreme care. The easiest way to move this material is by rail in giant flasks, but the movement of this material has raised some concerns. Just how strong are these flasks if they were hit by a train? In order to answer that question, the UK government decided to test it by smashing a locomotive into it. The plan was to release the findings to the public to allay any fears about sharing the network with the dangerous waste, and the government used steel rods and water in the place of fuel rods for the test. The container was battered and damaged, but it was still secure. The public was still unsure, so the government decided to conduct another test and drop the container about 30 feet on the flask's weakest point. The flask held firm, with a small amount of water leaking, not enough to cause any undue worry or be harmful. Crashes are not a nice part of railway life, but we can't acknowledge that they don't happen, and when they do, it's an opportunity to learn from them. I personally feel rather uncomfortable about taking two useful pieces of machinery and destroying them for pleasure. It may be a part of my upbringing, as I was always taught to look after my things, and I still own a lot of childhood treasures and that are in great condition and still work today. While it's not my scene, and I know some may enjoy the show, staging railway crashes just for fun is one part of railway life I'm personally glad is confined to history.